tsunami you can't see isn't crashing on distant shores or making headlines on the evening news. It's happening right inside the developing brain of a child who's experiencing trauma, and its waves continue to ripple through their entire life in ways that most of us never fully understand. When we think about tsunamis, we picture devastating walls of water that reshape entire coastlines in minutes, leaving behind a landscape that's forever changed. Childhood trauma works in remarkably similar ways, except instead of reshaping geography, it reshapes the very architecture of a developing mind. The work of Dr. Gabor Maté has shown us that what happens to us in our earliest years doesn't just stay in the past like old photographs in a dusty album. These experiences literally flood the brain with stress hormones and survival responses that can continue to surge through our neural pathways decades later, creating patterns of behavior, health challenges, and relationship dynamics that seem to come out of nowhere but actually have very deep and traceable roots. When a child experiences trauma, whether it's physical abuse, emotional neglect, witnessing violence, or even more subtle forms of emotional unavailability from caregivers, their brain doesn't process these events the way an adult mind might. Think of a child's brain like a house that's still under construction, where the electrical wiring isn't fully installed and the foundation is still being poured. When traumatic stress floods this developing system, it's like trying to install emergency generators and security systems before the basic infrastructure is even complete. The brain, in its incredible wisdom, prioritizes survival above all else. It begins to wire itself for a world that feels dangerous and unpredictable, creating neural pathways that are constantly scanning for threats, even when the child grows up and moves into environments that are actually safe. This isn't a conscious choice or a character flaw. It's literally how the developing nervous system adapts to protect itself when the people who are supposed to provide safety and regulation are either unable to do so or are themselves the source of the threat. The flooding metaphor becomes even more powerful when we understand that trauma doesn't just happen once and then disappear like a single wave. Instead, it creates what researchers call a dysregulated nervous system, where the child's internal alarm system gets stuck in the on position. Imagine living in a house where the smoke detector goes off every time you cook dinner, or where the security system is so sensitive that it triggers when a leaf falls on the front porch. This is what it's like for a child whose nervous system has been flooded with trauma responses. Their brain becomes hypervigilant, always ready to fight, flee, or freeze, even in situations that don't actually require these intense survival responses. The stress hormones cortisol and adrenaline, which are meant to help us respond to genuine emergencies, begin to course through their system on a regular basis, creating an internal environment that's chronically activated and never truly at rest. What makes this invisible tsunami so particularly devastating is that children don't have the cognitive capacity to understand what's happening to them or to make sense of their experiences in healthy ways. Unlike adults who can potentially recognize that they're in a traumatic situation and seek help or at least understand that what's happening isn't their fault, children naturally blame themselves. Their developing minds create stories like, "I must be bad," or "I'm not lovable," or "the world is dangerous and I can't trust anyone." These aren't just temporary thoughts that pass through their minds. These become core beliefs that get wired into their neural architecture at the deepest levels. It's like installing an operating system in a computer that contains fundamental coding errors, and then building every other program on top of that flawed foundation. Everything that comes after will be influenced by these early traumatic imprints. The brain's incredible plasticity, which is usually one of its greatest assets, becomes a double-edged sword in the context of childhood trauma. The same neuroplasticity that allows children to learn languages effortlessly and adapt to new environments with remarkable resilience also means that traumatic experiences get encoded with extraordinary depth and permanence. When a child's brain is repeatedly flooded with stress chemicals during critical developmental windows, it begins to organize itself around the expectation of chaos, abandonment, or danger. The neural networks that should be developing healthy attachment patterns, emotional regulation skills, and a basic sense of safety in the world instead become wired for hypervigilance, emotional reactivity, and relationship patterns that replay the original trauma dynamics over and over again throughout their lives. One of the most profound insights from Gabor Maté's work is understanding that what we often label as behavioral problems, learning difficulties, or even physical health issues in children and adults are frequently the downstream effects of this early neurological flooding. When a child acts out in school, has trouble concentrating, or seems unable to form healthy relationships, we're often seeing the aftermath of that invisible tsunami rather than character defects or moral failures. Their brain is simply doing exactly what it was trained to do during those critical early years when survival felt uncertain. The child who can't sit still in class might have a nervous system that's been conditioned to always be ready to run. The teenager who seems to pick fights or sabotage good relationships might be unconsciously replaying patterns that feel familiar, even though they're destructive, because familiar feels safer than unknown, even when unknown might actually be healthier. The ripple effects of childhood trauma extend far beyond behavior and relationships into the realm of physical health in ways that can seem almost magical if you don't understand the deep connection between mind and body. When a developing nervous system is chronically flooded with stress hormones, it doesn't just affect psychological development, it literally changes how the immune system functions, how inflammation responses work, and how the body manages everything from digestion to sleep cycles. Children who experience early trauma are statistically more likely to develop autoimmune conditions, chronic pain, digestive issues, and a whole host of physical health challenges that might seem completely unrelated to their psychological experiences. But when you understand that the brain and body are one integrated system, and that chronic stress literally rewrites the instruction manual for how that system operates, these connections begin to make perfect sense. Think about it this way. If you lived in a war zone, your body would naturally adapt by becoming hyperalert, sleeping lightly, having a hair-trigger stress response, and potentially having digestive issues because your system is always prioritizing immediate survival over long-term health maintenance. For a child experiencing trauma, their body makes similar adaptations, except they're supposed to be living in peacetime. Their system gets calibrated for an environment that requires constant vigilance and stress reactivity, and then they're expected to function in schools, relationships, and work environments that assume a much calmer, more regulated nervous system baseline. It's like trying to drive a race car that's been tuned for the Indianapolis 500 through a quiet neighborhood at 25 miles per hour. The mismatch creates all kinds of problems that might seem mysterious until you understand the underlying calibration. The invisible nature of this tsunami is part of what makes it so particularly challenging to address. When a child breaks their arm, everyone can see the cast and understands that they need time to heal and special accommodations while the bone mends. But when a child's nervous system has been flooded with trauma, there's no visible cast, no obvious sign that their internal architecture has been damaged and needs careful attention to heal properly. Instead, we often see behavioral manifestations that get labeled as defiance, attention problems, or emotional instability, and the underlying neurological injury remains invisible and unaddressed. This is like trying to fix a computer that keeps crashing by yelling at the screen instead of examining the corrupted code in the operating system. What's both heartbreaking and hopeful about understanding childhood trauma through this lens is recognizing that most of the behaviors and symptoms we see aren't signs of permanent damage or unfixable character flaws. They're actually evidence of a nervous system that's working exactly as it was designed to work given the environmental inputs it received during crucial developmental periods. The child who seems difficult or troubled is often a child whose brain made incredibly intelligent adaptations to survive in circumstances that no child should have to navigate alone. Their hypervigilance, emotional reactivity, or relationship difficulties aren't signs that something is wrong with them as people. They're signs that their nervous system learned to prioritize survival in an environment where survival felt uncertain. This understanding completely changes how we might approach healing and recovery from childhood trauma. Instead of trying to fix what's wrong with someone or convince them to just get over their past, we begin to recognize that we're working with a nervous system that needs to be slowly and carefully retrained to recognize safety when it actually exists. It's like helping someone who's been living in a war zone for years to gradually adjust to peacetime. Their hypervigilance and survival strategies made perfect sense in the context where they developed, but now they need gentle, consistent experiences of actual safety to begin rewiring their neural networks toward more regulated, peaceful baselines. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something I want you to really think about as we move through this together. How many of us carry the invisible effects of childhood trauma without even realizing it? Have you ever found yourself reacting to situations with an intensity that surprises even you? Or getting triggered by seemingly small things that shouldn't be such a big deal? Have you noticed patterns in your relationships or your health that seem to repeat regardless of how hard you try to change them? These might not be personal failings or character weaknesses. They might be the lingering waves of that invisible tsunami, still moving through your system in ways that your conscious mind hasn't fully recognized or understood. I want to pause here for a moment and just acknowledge everyone who clicked on this video and is taking the time to explore these ideas with me. Whether you're here because you're trying to understand your own experiences, support someone you care about, or simply expand your knowledge about how human beings develop and heal, I'm grateful that you're part of this conversation. These aren't easy topics to sit with, and yet they're so important for all of us to understand if we want to create a world where children can develop in environments that support their natural resilience and capacity for joy, rather than forcing them to adapt to circumstances that flood their developing nervous systems with survival responses. Now, as we continue exploring this concept of the invisible tsunami, I want to address a question that might be arising for some of you. If childhood trauma creates such deep and lasting changes in the brain, does that mean people are doomed to carry these effects forever? Are we talking about permanent damage that can't be healed or reversed? This is where the story becomes much more hopeful than you might expect. The same neuroplasticity that allowed traumatic experiences to reshape the developing brain also means that healing experiences can create new neural pathways throughout our entire lives. The brain that was flooded with trauma can also be bathed in experiences of safety, connection, and healthy regulation, gradually building new networks that support resilience rather than just survival. Think of it like this. Imagine your brain as a forest where certain pathways have been worn deep by years of foot traffic going in directions that were necessary for survival but aren't necessarily healthy for thriving. Healing from childhood trauma isn't about erasing those old pathways, which would be impossible and probably not even desirable since they represent incredible adaptations and survival wisdom. Instead, it's about gradually creating new pathways through the forest, walking them regularly until they become well-established routes that your nervous system can choose instead of automatically defaulting to the old survival trails. Over time, with consistent nurturing experiences, these new pathways can become the preferred routes, while the old trauma pathways remain available if truly needed but are no longer the default setting. The key insight from trauma-informed healing approaches is understanding that the nervous system that was shaped by chaos and unpredictability needs to experience safety and regulation repeatedly and consistently before it can begin to trust that the danger has actually passed. This isn't something that happens quickly or through willpower alone. Just like a tsunami-damaged coastline needs time and careful restoration to rebuild, a trauma-affected nervous system needs patient, consistent experiences of safety and attunement to gradually shift its baseline from survival mode to a more regulated, peaceful state. This might happen through therapy, through healing relationships, through body-based practices that help regulate the nervous system, or through any number of approaches that provide the consistent safety and co-regulation that the developing brain needed but didn't receive. One of the most beautiful aspects of understanding trauma through this lens is recognizing that healing isn't just an individual process. It's fundamentally relational. The nervous system that was injured in relationship can be healed in relationship. When we experience consistent safety, attunement, and healthy regulation with other people, our own nervous system begins to remember what peaceful baselines feel like. It's like having a calm, steady presence help tune an instrument that's been knocked out of key. Over time, through repeated experiences of healthy co-regulation, our own internal tuning begins to stabilize in healthier ranges. This is why therapeutic relationships can be so powerful, and also why healthy friendships, romantic partnerships, and even connections with pets or nature can all be part of the healing process. The implications of understanding childhood trauma as an invisible tsunami extend far beyond individual healing into how we structure our entire society. When we recognize that behavioral problems, learning difficulties, health challenges, and even criminal behavior often have roots in early developmental trauma, it completely changes how we might approach education, healthcare, criminal justice, and social services. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with this person?" We begin asking what happened to this person? And what do they need to feel safe enough to access their natural capacity for healing and growth? This shift in perspective opens up entirely different possibilities for intervention and support. Imagine if schools were designed with the understanding that many children are walking into classrooms with nervous systems that are calibrated for survival rather than learning. Instead of punishment-based discipline systems that often re-traumatize children who are already struggling with dysregulated nervous systems, we might create environments that prioritize safety, predictability, and emotional regulation as the foundation for academic learning. When a child acts out, instead of seeing defiance, we might recognize a nervous system that's been triggered into survival mode and respond with the kind of calm, consistent presence that helps re-regulate rather than escalate the situation. Similarly, when we understand that many physical health conditions have roots in early nervous system dysregulation, it opens up new possibilities for healing that address the whole person rather than just symptoms. Instead of only prescribing medications to manage chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, or digestive issues, healthcare providers might also explore trauma-informed approaches that help calm the nervous system and address the underlying dysregulation that's contributing to physical symptoms. This doesn't mean that trauma causes every health condition, but rather that for many people, addressing early developmental stress can be a powerful component of comprehensive healing. The ripple effects of this understanding extend into how we think about parenting and child development as well. When we recognize that children's brains are literally being shaped by their early experiences, it emphasizes the incredible importance of providing consistent safety, attunement, and emotional regulation during those crucial developmental years. This doesn't mean parents need to be perfect or that every moment of a child's life needs to be trauma-free, which would be impossible and probably not even helpful for building resilience. Instead, it means understanding that children need adults who can help them regulate their nervous systems when they become overwhelmed, who can provide repair and reconnection after ruptures, and who can model what healthy emotional regulation looks like. And here's something that might make you want to hit that like button, especially if you're finding this perspective as eye-opening as I hope you are. Understanding childhood trauma as an invisible tsunami doesn't just help us make sense of our own experiences or support others more effectively. It literally gives us a roadmap for preventing future generations from having to navigate these same challenges. When we understand how early experiences shape the developing brain, we can make conscious choices about how we interact with the children in our lives, whether as parents, teachers, aunts, uncles, neighbors, or simply members of a community that recognizes children as the incredibly vulnerable and precious developing beings they are. One of the questions that often arises when people first learn about the lasting impacts of childhood trauma is whether it's helpful or harmful to understand our current challenges through this lens. Some people worry that focusing on early experiences might become an excuse for not taking responsibility for their adult lives, while others worry that it might create a sense of hopelessness about the possibility of change. These are valid concerns, and the key is finding a balance that honors both the reality of how early experiences shape us and the incredible capacity for growth and healing that exists throughout our entire lives. Understanding the roots of our patterns isn't about staying stuck in victim identity. It's about developing compassion for why we developed certain coping strategies and making informed choices about which ones still serve us and which ones we might want to gradually update. The tsunami metaphor is particularly powerful because it helps us understand that trauma responses aren't character flaws or personal weaknesses. They're natural responses to overwhelming experiences. Just like no one would blame a coastal community for being damaged by an actual tsunami, we can begin to release self-blame and shame about the ways that early overwhelming experiences shaped our nervous systems and behavior patterns. This doesn't mean we're not responsible for our adult choices and actions, but rather that we can make those choices from a place of understanding and self-compassion rather than from shame and self-criticism. And now, I want to leave you with a reflection that I hope will stay with you long after this video ends. The invisible tsunami of childhood trauma is real, and its effects ripple through millions of lives in ways that often go unrecognized and unaddressed. But here's what gives me hope. Every time someone understands these concepts and begins to see their own experiences or the experiences of others through this more compassionate, informed lens, they become part of the healing. Every time an adult chooses to respond to a child's dysregulation with patience and co-regulation instead of punishment, they're helping to interrupt the cycle. Every time someone seeks their own healing and learns to regulate their nervous system in healthier ways, they're changing not just their own life, but potentially the lives of every person they'll interact with going forward. The beautiful truth is that healing is contagious in the same way that trauma can be. When we do our own work to address the lingering effects of early experiences, when we learn to recognize and soothe our own nervous system activation, when we develop the capacity to stay present and regulated even when others around us are struggling, we become sources of healing in the world. We become the kind of calm, consistent presence that can help other nervous systems remember what safety feels like. In this way, every person who commits to understanding and healing their own trauma responses becomes part of the solution, helping to create a world where fewer children will experience the kind of overwhelming circumstances that flood developing brains with survival responses. The work isn't easy, and it's not quick, but it's absolutely possible. The same brain that was shaped by early experiences of chaos or neglect can be reshaped by consistent experiences of safety, attunement, and healthy relationship. The nervous system that learned to expect danger can gradually learn to recognize and trust actual safety when it exists. The person who developed survival strategies that no longer serve them can slowly, patiently develop new patterns that support thriving rather than just surviving. And perhaps most importantly, the adult who understands their own story with compassion and wisdom can help ensure that the children in their life grow up with nervous systems that are wired for connection, resilience, and joy rather than just survival. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you've recognized aspects of your own experience in what we've discussed, or if you simply feel moved by the possibility of understanding human behavior and healing in this deeper way, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button to let me know this content is reaching people who find it valuable. And if you have your own experiences or insights related to childhood trauma and healing that you'd feel comfortable sharing, or if there are questions this has raised for you that you'd like to explore further, please don't hesitate to leave a comment below. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we realize we're not alone in our experiences. And your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you're interested in continuing this conversation and exploring more topics related to trauma, healing, and human resilience, consider subscribing to the Not What It Seems channel, where we regularly dive deep into the aspects of human experience that often go unexamined but profoundly shape our lives. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and remember that understanding is the first step toward healing.